Welcome to the recorded version of the webinar, Considerations for Building Capacity in Physical Abuse Cases. During this webinar, we experienced some technical difficulties, and the presentation will begin 20 minutes into the webinar. Thank you for joining us.
Whoever, but what I'm saying is you just have to keep in mind everybody's roles and everybody's role might have a different priority, but that's why we all work well together. And that's why communication is also key, because hearing from another discipline may change that, or I may be able to go to my supervisor and say, hey, I was looking at it this way after talking with the team. So thank you, Beth.
I think that's very important. Leanda, I think that's very important that people can come back from a team meeting and say, you know, we talked about this and I got this additional insight. And that really is what you want with collaboration.
Yes. So thank you, Beth. I think we are ready to move on to Kim. Kim is from York, PA, and she is a forensic interviewer who's going to speak now. And I'll let you, Kim, do your own introduction, okay?
All right, thank you. Yes, my name is Kim Duffy, and as was stated, I work in Pennsylvania, in York County, at our Children's Advocacy Center as a forensic interviewer. Just to give a little bit of history, I won't go into a full bio about myself, but 21 years of experience in the field. First 10 years were CPS, either doing the investigations or supervising the investigations, just so you know my background, and then transitioned into the world of children's advocacy centers. So I've actually worked at 2 different children's advocacy centers as forensic interviewers. And the benefit I've had, a little bit different from what we're talking about today, is the centers that I've worked at have already, we did not have to make this transition from the onset. We did both sexual and physical. So I did kind of have to shift my thinking a little bit as I was preparing to present today, but hopefully there'll be some value in that too, just as we're having the discussion, that I come from that place of already doing both. So looking specifically at the interviewing piece, I did, and if you want to advance to the next slide, I did kind of break out my presentation points and looking at the model of interviewing, and then some considerations for the team, and then the interviews themselves. So just want to make an acknowledgement that any forensic interviewer at a children's advocacy center that has been trained in one of the nationally recognized models of interviewing, all of those models acknowledge and are very appropriate for exploring incidents of both physical and sexual abuse. So if you are part of a CAC and part of a team where your interviewers have already gone through one of those nationally recognized models, we don't want you to feel like there's going to be this additional expectation that you have to send them off to some other training somewhere. All of those models are very appropriate for these cases as well, for exploring any kind of abuse or neglect situations. However, we would encourage you, and the national models would encourage as well, that you really look at the needs of your interviewer themselves and also the needs of your team. So if you feel like there would be additional training that would be beneficial to your interviewer looking at taking on these additional cases, some of the things that would be recommended would be to consider training on issues of poly-victimization. If you haven't had your interviewer already trained on the extended or expanded forensic interviews, seeking out training on those issues. And certainly anytime, we would always encourage interviewers and team members to be trained on ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. So those would be considerations that your team would want to look at, your CAC would want to look at. And also then just any other training that your team really feels appropriate. And maybe this is more specific to different dynamics that you have going on within your community or your county, that may assist your interviewer on when taking on these cases. So then advancing to the next slide, yes, thank you. Then looking at the team, and I feel like I'm going to repeat a lot of the points that have already been brought up today, but that cross-discipline training, we do that with our MDT constantly. So if you're looking at taking on physical abuse cases, that dynamic is still going to be there and that need is still going to be there the same as it would be for any other situation. So we've talked about the fact that there might be new players coming on board, so that training on the process itself the use of the CAC, the county protocol, the investigative protocol, and then the laws and mandates of each discipline that's involved in those cases. We want everyone to be on the same page, understanding everybody's role, and just encouraging that cross-discipline training. And then really also ensuring that your interviewer is really familiar with if this is a new type of case that they're going to be doing. Not that the interview structure itself is going to change, but the nuances that come with looking at the needs of the team members now from that investigative perspective. So having them familiar with what the expectations from CPS are. What are they specifically going to be looking to get from those interviews? What's law enforcement going to be looking to get from those interviews? So I can say here in Pennsylvania, some easy examples that I can give under our Child Protective Services law, which governs our CPS, we really need to look at getting pain and impairment statements from children. So having your interviewers understand that's going to be an expectation in going into those interviews, and that's going to be a need of one of the team members. CPS also has a requirement that in order for them to be able to indicate the injury had to have occurred within the past 2 years. So we really just want to make sure our interviewers are familiar with those expectations so that they can meet the needs of the team during those interviews. I also think, and this was another point that was already brought up, the need for the team and interviewers to recognize that in these situations, especially if the physical abuse is happening with younger children, there might be more of a need for interviewing witnesses to the child who is actually identified as the victim. So if you have a young child with a skull fracture or a spiral fracture who isn't verbal enough to be interviewed, looking at interviewing the siblings in the home. Also, if you have a child death as a result of physical abuse, looking at interviewing those siblings in the home. So making sure, again, that everybody's on the same page with who's going to be within your protocol, who's going to be referred into the Center for Forensic Interviews, making sure that the team's comfortable with, and that might be a shift in practice a bit, that the focus for forensic interviews isn't just on your identified victim, but may include more of those witness interviews so that your interviewer is prepared to handle those cases. Your team understands the expectation that those cases are going to get referred into your center, and that might just be a bit of a shift in practice. Then also just training your team in general. That could include, again, training on the ACE study, risk of recurrent physical abuse, so that they understand, and I know this was already brought up, there are different expectations when it comes to the thought process of physical abuse. So all of us get and recognize, and no one questions that sexual abuse isn't okay of kids. But when you look at physical abuse or physical discipline, as our last speaker just mentioned, there are different belief systems about what physical abuse, what's acceptable, what it can look like, what it shouldn't look like. So having that, your entire team have the opportunity to be trained on some of those issues, discuss those issues, and not necessarily that you're going to change the opinion of certain team members, but ensuring that everybody has the same objective for what is the expectation is going to be for these investigations. And then just, again, recognizing that there are different social norms with regard to physical abuse cases. So I think we're okay to advance to the next slide. So then for the interviews themselves, looking really at, as the interviewer, a lot of the times what it's going to come down to is separating out, is this discipline or is this a non-discipline event? So I think Beth had brought up the excellent point at really looking at parental intent versus extent of injury. So that is going to be, in certain situations with your interviews, a big focus of what that interviewer is going to be attempting to separate out the context with which that happened in. Was the child being disciplined because they beat up another child at school or because they spilled a glass of milk during dinner? Or was this some incident that wasn't even discipline related and resulted in the child being injured? And if it was discipline driven, how was this time different from any other time that child has been disciplined? What was being used to discipline that child? Who was doing the disciplining of the child? And obviously looking then at the extent of the injury. Also, interviewers may need to look at expanding that touch language, which isn't an unusual practice for forensic interviewers. We often have to look at, even when we're doing our sexual abuse interviews, going beyond the word touch to really get at the experiences that children have, and realizing that a touch doesn't fully cover everything that may happen in terms of sexual abuse of a child. The same is going to go for physical abuse of a child. So having your interviewer really be mindful of that practice during forensic interviews, and looking to include terms that are very appropriate for the community and the culture that you live in. So is it common for whoopings to happen, or spankings to happen, or beatings to happen? But other terminology that would help to get at experiences that that child has had outside of just using the word touch. And as I already talked about, the fact that the national models support and are appropriate for use in the physical abuse interviews, any of the interview aids that would be included when your interviewer goes to get trained in those national models, and different national models support different aids being used in interviews. But whatever aid, if that interviewer was taught to use a certain aid that's appropriate for sexual abuse cases, they would be just as appropriate for physical abuse cases. So if your interviewer was trained in an aid that supports the use of anatomical diagrams, those same diagrams that are used to explore sexual abuse can be used to explore physical abuse, whether that be for anatomy identification, the touch inquiry phase, or clarification about what happened to that child's body. Those diagrams can be used for the physical abuse cases just as well. If your center or the model that your your interviewer was trained in supported the use of the dolls, they can be used for sexual abuse just as they can be used for clarification for physical abuse. And then certainly the drawings. If that was something that your interviewer was trained in, they can have the child make a drawing of the room or the implement that was used for physical abuse cases, just as we would gather some of those details and use those aids for sexual abuse cases. So I think the last thing that I wanted to highlight is just some of the resources that are available, and one of those is included as one of the handouts, the physical abuse modification, which is a link to that, even though you have it as a handout, is also included in the guide that was put out by NCA. And then also within the guide is a link for the child forensic interviewing best practices that was published back in September of 2015. And then I would also encourage teams to really also look at statistics that are specific to your state, your county, or your community. So when you're looking at taking on these additional cases, looking at the volume of cases that you have. What are your rates for physical abuse in your county? What are your rates for physical abuse in your state? And then also looking at child death rates related to physical abuse to really get a grasp of the problem that you're going to be tackling. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I want, and Kim, I'm sorry, of course, again, I guess being the facilitator, I get to come up with questions on my own. But one thing that you said about the different belief systems, what I would encourage everybody to do is know the law in your area, because you can have a belief system, but you still have to know what the law is and what is considered abuse in your state. So what might be considered abuse in Maryland may not be abuse in another state. So I think that's important too. If you're going to take on these cases, knowing what your actual law is that constitutes abuse. So then, yes, you may have a member who has a belief, but we always, as we all know, have to go back to what does the law say about it. So I just wanted to bring that point up.
And Leanda, right now Justin's having some problems getting on, but I wanted to ask you, Kim, and Beth. A lot of, I think, as we're looking at capacity, of course, I mean, this really is resource intensive if depending on the quantity of cases that you're handling. But I want to take you and Beth specifically back to, the days before the Child Advocacy Center was handling physical abuse cases and try to explain, what were some of the steps that you took, not only, and traditionally, when we say before a CAC is handling it, traditionally you have the law enforcement criminal investigation division handling some of the major cases, and then CPS handling almost everything else, and including those major cases, to where now, there's a lot of collaboration on all of those cases. And that's a big difference for a child advocacy center. And I want to ask, both of you, where and how did that even begin? What was the conversations, if you can recall? And if there are some of our audience members here that's where they're at, what are some of the suggestions that you would give to even begin those conversations?
Well, and I would say, this is Leanda, Dave, if you recall, it's when I came to the center at Harford County and you and I started having discussions about it. It started with you and I just discussing it. And then it was getting our administrations to get any kind of buy-in. Because we saw the recognition that, wow, this is something we could do. Even if we couldn't do it for all cases because of our size, how could we help those most vulnerable? But that was a hard sell to administration first. And then, of course, we had our speed bumps where we started taking too many cases and law enforcement couldn't keep up. That was at the CAC. We didn't get extra law enforcement. We were allowed to do it, but they didn't give anybody else to help. And for CPS, at that time, we only had sex abuse there, and we didn't take those cases. So it was new workers who'd never worked with law enforcement or the CAC before. So we had some speed bumps there. And then finally we came up with, I guess it was a policy saying what cases we would take through the center and what cases we just couldn't. So for us at that time, we had, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but I believe we went with anywhere it was, any of the severe, if it was a hospital, like a child was hospitalized, broken bones, skull fracture, anything like that were more severe. We also looked at, like, if it was a daycare provider or a school, but tried to boil it down to where it was the more severe cases, because we couldn't keep up with how many physical abuse referrals there were coming into CPS.
Right. We definitely have to prioritize because, we went from handling, if I recall, 350 sex abuse cases to then almost, which we could have if we were to handle everything, almost tripling that with physical abuse cases.
Yes.
So I do remember we did prioritize, and even, even I think as time has gone on, we're handling more of those where, even if it's just an injury, a visible injury that we were handling at the CAC, but it took a lot of work with that. And Beth, maybe you can add on to where, if you recall some of those conversations prior to as well.
Well, I think our experience was probably very similar to yours. We had one interim director before I came who had been here just for a few months. So like the first year that we kind of sort of operated, we maybe had 40 kids. And then when I rolled in, we had a whole lot real fast. But like you all, we started out with the more serious physical abuse. And it was defined as serious or harmful physical abuse and neglect, because, sometimes we've had some cases, and we're not even talking about those here, where like serious medical neglect, things that could require an intervention or a prosecution was kind of the way our standard started. And it has changed through the years, and it has changed as much as anything, I believe, because the team members have brought additional things and have said, could we also do this? So one of the things I have seen is that people now consider us a resource versus just another step in the investigation. So we're not just a resource to get an interview done, because we, of course, started like everybody else doing interviews. It is a resource for information and a resource for consultation. And I think that is one of the very best things the CAC can do. And when I came here from public practice, and I retired as a program manager, so I had a lot of counties, but everybody was still struggling with the cases falling through the cracks, even the serious cases that had been done by DHHR or done by law enforcement. They just kind of dropped off a cliff. And I think those, in my opinion, allowing a team to grow and allowing a center to, everybody starts at a point. And then as you develop more expertise and more comfort and figure out what your resources are, you can change that. You can expand that. You can have somebody identified that's going to provide mental health services specific to this if you have a big population of kids who've been physically abused. I really like the collaboration the best. But yes, we started with injury-driven, serious physical abuse, and then sexual abuse. And through the years, and I've been at it 12 years now. We really have, it has kind of changed. It has really gone more towards safety, although everybody has their own responsibility within the team. And I'm sure part of the reason that we've gone toward safety and gone toward a lot of well-being and permanency is because I'm a social worker. I'm a licensed social worker. And our program director is a licensed social worker. And one of our advocates is, so we have CPS history here anyway. We've got a bunch of retirees hiding out. But I think it's really important that people can bring cases that are confusing them, whether they really absolutely fit a cookie cutter definition or not. If people just want to be able to discuss a case, I think it's important that they can have the time to say, this is what is troubling me. So I like the idea that we are a resource and that we have enough expertise on our team, even when we don't agree, and we're open enough that everybody can say, well, in my opinion, this was this, and in my opinion, this is what's important. And so we collaborate, and that's the real key to being a child advocacy center, I think.
Great, thanks. And I just want to make sure, Leanne, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there. We still don't have our last presenter, just to let you know. But Kim, I wanted to get your thoughts, but also just to give everybody that opportunity to ask questions. This would be a good time to do that. If you could type that question in the box for you. And Leanne, I'll turn it back over to you. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's fine. I was just going to ask if Justin was on.
No, he's having some technical difficulties. So we're going to skip that piece, but I did want to get Kim's thought on that. Kim, you've had quite a range of experience as far as probably the point of just handling sex abuse cases to now handling everything. And as a forensic interviewer, that I think that can also be intensive or resource intensive as well. So some of your thoughts on and suggestions on where the CAC can at least start and look at how they're going to handle those physical abuse cases at the CAC?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I did say at the beginning, I've never had to go through that transition, but just thinking that through and having worked at 2 different CACs and working with MDT members, I think a lot of the points that have been brought up are really good and things that you want to take into consideration when you are thinking about making that change. So really taking time to sit down with your team and identify, especially if you are in like here in York County in Pennsylvania, we're 3rd in the state. We're just behind Philadelphia and Pittsburgh in terms of our rates of abuse. So we have a high volume caseload already. So looking at staff, really taking time to sit down with your team and identifying really clearly what cases are most appropriate to be brought into your center to be interviewed, and what realistically does your center have the capacity to hold? Can you hire another interviewer? If you only have one interviewer on staff already, how many additional cases can that individual take on to handle interviews for? And then looking at, too, just for the interviewer themselves, even though the national models support interviewing for both physical and sexual, there are different nuances to the interviews with the physical abuse. So recognizing that there is going to be that learning curve for your interviewer as they step into that role, and there is going to be kind of that give and give and take between them and the team members until they kind of get it all worked out as to the interviewer really understanding what the team needs and the team really even knowing how to communicate and get out of that forensic interview what they need. And then also too with interviewers, I can speak looking at kind of at that vicarious trauma piece. If you've done sexual abuse for so long, as we all know, having worked in this field for a while, you begin to become kind of almost resistive and not as sensitive to those situations. And then if you're put in a position where you're doing those forensic interviews on those physical abuse cases, even though it's still abuse of a child, it may impact that individual differently. And so it may be almost like they're fresh into this process and may have more of an emotional response to those physical abuse cases, even though they've been an interviewer for years and possibly have already interviewed hundreds of kids relating to sexual abuse. There may still be that different impact. So just even looking at that interviewer's needs and how you best support them through that transition and process.
If I may, Leandra, I think, Kim, that's a very important piece. You can become, I don't want to say desensitized, but I think that interviewers make an adjustment to handling horrible things they hear about one type of abuse. My experience is, and I have interviewed, I used to train interviewers too, but anyway, suddenly something else happens and it really does have an impact. It's something new. And that's a very important piece that I think you just discussed. And, you know, many places I'm sure have gifted interviewers that can do both. I think as a director, if I was looking at expanding into physical abuse or new type of maltreatment, I would have a discussion with my interviewer and I would try to pay very close attention to were they having reactions to this new form of abuse, whether they were aware of it or not. Because they may not be. But we all have experiences where we've done investigations or CPS work for many, many years, and then suddenly something comes along that really gets to you. And I think that could very easily happen with an interviewer who suddenly has to assimilate a whole new type of maltreatment. So it's very interesting.
This is Leanda. I agree. And one thing it brought to mind for me was one of my interviewers, the first time they had to interview a child who witnessed the death of their sibling. And they had done some of the most horrendous sex abuse cases, sex trafficking cases, even physical abuse cases. But this one, she was not prepared for hearing about in detail what this child had witnessed. And so, you know, we didn't think about this. This was just a witness interview. So those are different things that you have to take into account when you open up this door.
You know, I always tend to think of maltreatment, and I know that we're very comfortable with sexual abuse, thinking about it as a continuum with grooming and preparatory behavior. But there's a similarity very often with physical abuse, too. And so I think that's something people can try to keep in mind when they're looking at these cases. You don't generally go from zero to a fatality. And what we have talked about in our team before in several situations, because a couple of us used to do fatality reviews too, are the common markers you see when you look back at fatality cases, when you look at the history. Now, that doesn't mean it was obvious when it was happening, but there does appear to be a continuum very often for physical abuse cases, just like there is for sexual, in my experience.
Great. I want to encourage everybody out there. I'm not getting any questions. So if you have questions, please put them up there. We are more than glad to answer them. I want to remind everybody too, if you could please do the evaluations. Those are important for us to know what we need to work on, do better, you know, all of that stuff. Sorry, I'm not good at this. All right, thank you. Looks like we might have a question. Will this be available afterwards? Yes, so David said at the beginning, this is being recorded. Dave, I'll let you go ahead and answer that.
Yep, We're going to go ahead and record this. Obviously, we have it recording now, and I will find a place on NCA's website to host this. But in the meantime, if there is somebody that was not able to attend, and you think this is good information for them to hear, shoot me an email, ask me for the link, and I will send that to you with no problems. And as Leanda did say, we do encourage you to fill out that evaluation for us. We do apologize. We had some technical difficulties with getting our last presenter on. But if there are any questions, I mean, our panelists, I'm sure, are more than happy to answer your questions. If you think of something after the webinar, you want to send a question to me or the panelists, I'm going to put up their contact information here for you. Justin was not able to make it, but if you have some legal issues or legal concerns, if you don't know Justin, he's more than happy to answer those questions for you if he can, or he'll certainly point you in the right direction. We're gonna hang out for another minute and see if any more questions come in, and then if not, we'll give you a couple minutes back to your day. I do want to thank Leanda for taking the time to facilitate this for us. Beth, thank you for taking the time out of your busy days and helping us out with this webinar. And Kim, I know that you are one busy forensic interviewer, and I appreciate what you're doing for not only the kiddos in your jurisdiction, but for taking the time out and being part of this webinar as well.